Hello, and welcome to the Skillful podcast, where we explore DBT and RODBT skills to help you reduce emotional suffering, improve your relationships, and become more present in your life. I'm your host, Mariel Berg, a psychotherapist at the Bay Area DBT and Couples Counseling Center. So today, Ed and I are going to be diving into the distress tolerance skill called pros and cons. And so similarly to many of the other skills, like the skill is in the name, I'm sure many listeners have informally used pros and cons lists when they have difficult decisions to make in their minds. The skill is a bit more involved, and we have some things to unpack a little bit about this skill that will help really make it useful when you are facing a tough decision.
And I think this skill is definitely helpful to do in moments where our distress level is lower, to use to remind ourselves of our goals when our distress level is higher. So we'll get into how to do this in a moment of lower stress in order to pull it back as a reminder in moments of higher stress.
And on that note, to get us started, let's review states of mind, because it's been a little while since we talked about this concept, although I know we refer to the idea of wise mind often.
Basically, wise mind, the concept we've talked about before, is a state where we are balancing what we all have, which is our emotion mind and our reasonable mind. And so we spend a lot of time in DBT trying to mindfully notice, what state of mind am I in right now? Am I in really strong emotion mind, where emotions are driving the car? And like really that's the predominant experience, is what I'm feeling emotionally. Am I more in a reasonable mind state, which is more factual, getting into just the facts of the situation without much attention to emotion? Or do I have a balance between the two, where I'm bringing in my emotional awareness as well as facts, which gets me to this place that we call wise mind?
And ideally, we're making as many decisions as we can from this wise mind place. And sometimes people feel like, I don't have wise mind. I was just born without one. And I would say that, or I think we might say that we all have the potential to access that wise place in ourselves. It just might take a little bit of practice. And some synonyms for wise mind that might be useful to think about are intuition, or sometimes people talk about like a gut sense of just kind of knowing that something is right or wrong.
And I find the differentiation in DBT between wise mind and emotion mind to be helpful, because so often when people are talking about, oh, my intuition told me, very often what we're talking about is our emotion mind told us. Like, I was feeling extremely angry and my intuition told me that that person was doing me wrong. And we've had those experiences where it's like, oh, I was actually really misinterpreting the situation and my anger was not necessarily based in what was really happening. And in DBT, we recognize that sometimes we are in that emotion mind place where it's like, oh, my emotions are so strong, it's coloring all of my thoughts. And other times we're able to recognize, I'm really feeling pretty balanced right now. And, I'm noticing my anger. I'm also noticing that this other person did X, Y, and Z, and that was really harmful. Like my intuition is telling me that this is somebody I need to maybe stay away from. So that's the difference between emotion, mind, intuition, quote unquote. And I'm making quotation marks with my fingers as if anyone can see me. So emotion, mind versus wise mind, intuition.
That's such a good point, because so often, especially for folks who feel strong emotions, and I think particularly with anger, and I've been in this place myself where it feels like so right. I feel so justified. And in that moment, I would probably say, yes, this is my wise mind, and I need to tell you off, in the harshest way possible. And only in retrospect do I realize, like, oh, my subjective units of distress, or SUDs, which we'll talk about in a moment or we'll review again, that was through the roof, and I'm full on in emotion mind. And that doesn't mean that when I sort of calm down and I access my wise mind, I'm not still angry. But as you said, it comes out or gets expressed very differently.
Right. And again, like with most things in DBT, we're looking for that dialectical balance between two things that may seem opposite. So the balance, wise mind, is this balance between emotion and reason. We need both. We cannot just have one or the other. And so what we're looking for is, am I in that balanced place?
And the whole reason why we decided to review states of mind and wise mind in particular before we dived into the pros and cons skill is that we do the skill when we are in wise mind.
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing a pros and cons very often of patterns of behavior that we engage in when we're in emotion mind. So it's a way of kind of communicating between the two states of mind, because when you're in high emotion mind, it's really easy to lose sight of long-term goals or values. Emotion mind often wants to get us to act really quickly to just relieve distress, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Let's move on and talk about distress tolerance, kind of the whole idea of it in general, just as a quick review before we dive into the skill. So, in distress tolerance, we're learning a whole bunch of ways to get through what DBT calls a crisis situation. And you can really think of that broadly. It's basically any situation where your emotional distress is super high and you're in danger of doing or saying something that you're going to later regret. And that can also include avoiding doing something that you might need to do. And if you avoid that thing, it can create additional problems. And the overarching goal isn't necessarily to make you feel better, although that's great if that happens. But you have been successful in using your distress tolerance skills if you get through that crisis time without making things worse for yourself.
Right. And I really find that to be a helpful framework. People will often say when I'm talking to them about distress tolerance skills, oh, it didn't work because I didn't feel better. And again, the goal with distress tolerance isn't to feel better. The goal is to not feel worse, especially to not feel worse because I did something reactive in a moment of high stress that then I regret. So distress tolerance is about just getting through without doing anything that we'll regret in the long run.
Another tool that's useful to think about, and we will attach this in the show notes, is our subjective units of distress, or SUDs that we call it for short, which is a way of gauging how much emotional distress you're in.
So the subjective units of distress scale, SUDs, is a 0 to 10 scale rating. What level of distress do I have? From 0, which is no distress at all, total peace, to 10, which is absolute maximum, worst ever amount of distress. And it's subjective because each of us has our own definition of what does it mean to be at no distress? What does it mean to be at maximum? What does it mean to be at a SUDS level of 5, like kind of in between the two? And so it's not, this is not objective in the sense of like there's a universal scale that fits everyone. It's subjective for each of us. And we each come up with our own scale that helps us to identify a little bit more objectively than, oh, I feel horrible, which doesn't give us a lot of helpful information, to like, where am I on this scale? Am I at a 6? Am I at an 8? Where am I at in my stress level?
And if people can spend some time familiarizing themselves with this SUD scale, it can be very helpful in getting to know the nuances of your own shifting emotional state. Because I was just thinking about this when you said a moment ago, Ed, when people say, oh, I feel horrible or terrible, that there's a whole bunch of different levels or gradations in between feeling maybe a little mildly upset to freaking out and being in your worst possible state. And so I think looking at the SUD scales can help you get to know your emotional world a little bit more thoroughly. Because a lot of times we may not notice. It might feel like we've gone from 0 to 60, or in our case, because we're using the scale, from like 0 to 10 in a minute, when my hunch is that there have been like steps or markers along the way. Maybe your breath got shallow, you started to not think very clearly, that there's been little things along the way that have let you know, like, I'm not doing okay. And I think when we can become familiar with some of those for ourselves, because for everyone it's a little bit different. I know for me, I'll start clenching my teeth.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm like, oh God, why do I have like a pain and this headache? And that to me is a sign that like my that dial on my distress is being turned up. And so for, it's these are as unique as every individual, what it might be for you. But this is a way to also help you with some emotional control. If you can learn some of the signals for yourself that can alert you to rising distress, I think it can be really helpful.
And one of the things when we talk about SUDs in our skills group around distress tolerance, one of the things that we identify is that when we are feeling strong distress, when our emotions are really high and it's making it hard for us to act in a way that would be wise, taking a moment to check and rate our distress level brings in some of that reasonable mind to balance out the strong emotion. Instead of saying, oh, I feel horrible, being able to say, oh, what's my SUDS right now? I am at a 7, I think, a 7 out of 10. We're bringing in that more reasonable mind, factual side to strike a little bit more of a balance. And just that checking our SUDS can be helpful in bringing down the intensity of the emotion.
And so we use the skill pros and cons what would you say, Ed, when we're sort of like at a 5 or below?
I mean, I think 5 or 6 really, because when we talk about our SUD scale in skills group, we say like 8, 9, 10, we literally can't think. We just really can't think clearly. So 6, 5, 6 at the max, where like we're aware of distress, but we're not really at any risk of acting on it.
The pros and cons skill is really helpful to kind of map out the advantages and the disadvantages of different options. And so we want to do this when we have some access to wise mind, so that 5 or 6 or below place on your SUDS scale. It helps us figure out how to make wise choices. And it's really kind of the opposite of acting automatically or habitually, which so many of us do without thinking about like long-term consequences, both negative and positive. And so it's super helpful to use this skill to help you resist like impulsive or kind of destructive urges that might come up, because usually when you have those kind of urges, you're in high SUDS, high emotion mind, and you're not thinking very clearly, and acting on your urge feels like the smartest thing you can do in that moment.
So, like examples of a more kind of destructive urge would be like when our emotions are really high, we want to turn to substances or other kind of compulsive behaviors. We want to turn to suicidal thinking. And really nurture that type of thinking. We have an urge to lash out. So I'm angry and I just want to lash out. We have an urge to shut down. And so I withdraw. I don't attend to the things that need to be done in my life. All of those are examples of urges that we might go with in a moment of high distress that are going to cause longer term consequences.
Yeah, they provide this immediate relief, but then down the road, there's problems. So they might be kind of more like overt things, like you lose a friendship because of something you said or did. But sometimes the negative long-term consequences have to do more with like our self-respect and our self-esteem, like our sense of how we view ourselves gets damaged.
Right, totally.
And I would say the overarching also goal of this skill is a lot around accepting reality, like as it is, and tolerating distress.
Being able to recognize that we are going to have distress. There's going to be times when we are going to feel emotionally overwhelmed. It happens. Being able to know ourselves enough to know that in those moments, I might want to do something that I really don't want to do. And so using a pros and cons list ahead of time helps us think through what are my long-term goals versus just my short-term goals.
And let's dive now into kind of the meat of the skill, because it's unique. If you've been listening to us talk about pros and cons and refer to it, you might think, okay, yeah, I know what a pros and cons list is. I've done it. I know what that's about, but there's a twist to it.
So in DBT, the way that we would apply pros and cons is that you identify crisis behavior and urge that you have in crisis situations or high distress situations that doesn't serve you and that you would like to change. And you sit down and you make a list of the pros of acting on that crisis urge, as well as the cons of acting on that crisis urge. And then you also identify the pros of resisting the crisis urge and the cons of resisting the crisis urge. So pros and cons in DBT is kind of a 4-box approach of the pros and cons of both acting on the urge as well as the pros and cons of resisting the urge. So you get a really broad picture of what is going into this crisis urge.
And sometimes there's overlap, or often there is, but it can be surprising some of the things that come up when you do both the pros and cons of acting on the urge and resisting the urge. When we're in wise mind, or we have a lower SUDs level, it can be very obvious to us as to why we would want to resist acting on a crisis urge. So why we'd want to resist doing some kind of behavior that might make things worse in the long run. But we might forget that there are also cons. There are disadvantages or downsides to resisting those crisis urges. And a lot of times I think and it will vary depending on what the issue is, the downside or the disadvantages is that you're going to feel not very good. You're going to feel maybe really angry or really uncomfortable or some sort of very distressing state.
So when people are doing pros and cons of a crisis urge, invariably, one of the pros of acting on the crisis urge is immediate relief, which is a huge motivator. And that's why we all have these behaviors that when we're feeling overwhelmed in one way or another, we just want immediate relief, and we know this behavior will bring relief. So I think it's helpful to identify that it's not just, oh, I'm a bad person who has no self-control and I always act on these crisis urges. It's like, no, when I'm overwhelmed, I want relief. It feels miserable to feel those feelings that are driving this urge. And so it is a pro of acting on that crisis urge to get that relief. On the other hand, very often a con of resisting the urge is I have to sit with whatever those feelings are I'm trying to avoid.
Yeah, and sometimes I think the way we teach this in group is we kind of teach the pros and cons at the beginning of our distress tolerance module. But sometimes I think maybe it's better to teach it towards the end, because if your only option is, if you resist your crisis urge, the only option is to feel like crap, like that's not going to be very appealing or motivating. So
Right.
if you have other tools or other skills at your disposal, you can feel a sense of like, okay, I don't just have to suffer. There's something I can do, self-soothing or some other kind of distracting skill to help me get through this really uncomfortable period. And I want to add just another piece, because sometimes there's a resistance to doing pros and cons of especially more habitual crisis urges. So maybe, as you said, Ed, like thinking suicidal thoughts, any kind of self-harm, any sort of addictive or compulsive or impulsive behaviors, because those behaviors or urges give us something. It might be important to honor and respect the wisdom in some of the crisis urges that you struggle with repeatedly, that there's a part of you that's trying to give yourself some relief, some out, some period of checking out, some kind of break. And if you don't have any other tools or things at your disposal, then it makes sense that you've learned over time to turn to the things you turn to.
And in DBT, we're always seeking that balance between acceptance and change, recognizing that we need both. So often we can be unsuccessful in trying to change compulsive, impulsive behaviors because we don't accept, I've needed this. this was adaptive for me to develop a way to take a break from overwhelming emotion. And starting with some acceptance of like, yeah, for whatever reason, it may have caused me a lot of problems, but I needed this behavior to get by. And I would like to work on changing that so that I have more options so that I don't need it in the same way when I'm feeling strong emotions.
Yeah. And on that note, let's go through a pros and cons. Are you up for that?
Sure.
So I know not to put you on the spot too much, but you've talked about your struggles with procrastination. And I'm wondering what it would be like for us to do a pros and cons together right now.
It will probably be very helpful and also uncomfortable.
There's the dialectic.
There it is.
Or why don't you begin by describing, because you know your procrastination obviously much better than I do. And I feel like for everyone, procrastination can look a little bit differently. So what's the problem behavior that you have with procrastination, or set the scene for us?
Where this becomes difficult for me is when I have discomfort around some task that I need to do, I want to avoid it, which avoidance is a very natural response to anxiety or worry or that kind of thing. It can really become a habit for me. So my approach, for instance, if I have work stuff that I need to do, I want to do everything else first and then get to the most important thing, the thing that's causing me the most stress last, which means sometimes, oh no, I have to put that off until tomorrow. And that can drag on and cause a lot of discomfort because I'm avoiding a task that I don't want to do.
Okay. So what are the pros of acting on the urge? Like, what are the pros of procrastinating?
I get a sense of immediate relief of like, there's something that I don't want to do and I don't have to do it right now.
Any other pros or advantages to the procrastination?
I mean, that's really the biggest one, is that immediate relief, that sense of like, I don't want to do this and I don't have to.
Is freedom, like, with that kind of feeling, would that go along with it as another pro? Like, do you feel a
Yeah.
sense of that?
Yeah. Like freedom and a sense of power in a way
Mm-hmm.
of like, I don't want to do this and I choose not to, even though very often it's more impulsive than that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a part of it.
So immediate relief, freedom, power, those are the pros. Those are the
Hmm.
positives of why you procrastinate. Anything else?
No, that covers it.
Okay, what are the cons? What are the disadvantages of procrastination?
Basically, postponing the discomfort of doing the task I want to avoid. So the task still has to be done. I'm just postponing the discomfort, feeling a sense of having something hanging over my head.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, I have immediate relief. And then until I do the task, in the back of my mind is, oh, I have to do that task.
So you sort of have this like nagging worry that doesn't go away. That's a downside
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
procrastinating. What about your sense of self? Like, suppose you have
Mm.
an afternoon set aside to take care of work tasks, and you procrastinate on the most important and maybe the most challenging thing. How do you feel after those hours have passed about yourself?
Yeah. Usually feel relief as well as shame. And a sense of like, oh, other people don't struggle with this. Other people don't do this. If anyone knew that I was procrastinating, quote unquote, for no good reason, they would be so dismissive of me. So yeah, it kind of flares up that sense of like, oh, this is a bad thing. I shouldn't be doing this.
So that shame, or there's something kind of wrong with me and other people don't struggle this way. It sounds like it's a isolating kind of place to be.
Yeah, definitely.
And then if we move on to the pros of resisting the urge to procrastinate. So again, there might be some overlap with what we've already talked about. So what are the advantages of resisting the urge to procrastinate?
So instead of feeling that combination of when I am procrastinating, feeling that combination of relief as well as kind of dread that's in the background, when I just do the task, I get the relief without the dread.
Mm-hmm.
So I do get relief, and I don't have something hanging over my head. My sense of shame is much less. And in fact, when I actually do the task that I might want to avoid, I feel proud of myself for building mastery, to use another DBT skill, and doing something that I struggle with.
Okay, so there's relief without the dread. Shame goes way down if it's even there at all. And then this really important piece where you feel a sense of pride. You've
Mm-hmm.
built some mastery. You did the hard thing.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of advantages or pros to not procrastinating. What are the cons or the disadvantages to resisting procrastination?
The immediate sense of like, oh, I have to do this thing now.
Mhm.
And so that kind of desire to avoid something that causes discomfort or causes anxiety, I'm not avoiding it. It's right there.
So the downside of resisting the procrastination is you might feel like overwhelmed or anxious or
Yeah,
confused or depending on what the task is, like it just might be uncomfortable for a
right.
while.
Yeah, yeah.
And so as we've laid this out, anything new or surprising come up for you?
So this isn't the first time I've done this.
This is not your first procrastination rodeo.
No. And actually, as I'm reflecting on it, I have definitely made some progress in it, and it still comes up, especially when I am not mindful. So when I'm not conscientious about working on procrastination can easily slip in. This is a very well worn habit for me since childhood. So doing this again, like what I recognize is that like the discomfort of actually doing the task and getting it over with is definitely uncomfortable short term without any long term discomfort. Whereas avoiding does bring relief, but it also brings that sense of dread of I'm going to have to do this eventually. So while it may feel like a relief to procrastinate, it actually has like this paired quality of like, oh, the dread is going to carry on. So it's actually not that great. I don't get that much relief from procrastinating.
Mm-hmm. And there, you may be struggling with procrastination in one way or another for much of your life, if this is sort of how you've been for a long period of time. But it sounds like you are moving towards less of it with the goal of not being a perfect human being, because we're never going to achieve that. And that actually sounds a bit boring, but just to create more ease in your life
Hmm.
and to decrease some of these more painful emotions like shame or what's wrong with me or
Right.
other people would judge me if they knew about this.
Exactly. Yep.
And so we invite listeners to try this out for themselves and to do this again while your SUDS is low, while you can access Wise Mind. And then the key is to carry it with you and have it, even review it on a regular basis because it kind of reinforces it. Because when your emotion is really high, so when you have a really kind of unappealing task to do, Ed, like if you can pull out your pros and cons list for procrastination, it will likely serve as a reminder because you might not be able to access Wise Minds in that moment to be like, oh, yes, this is why I want to not procrastinate now.
And that's what I find helpful about a pros and cons list when I've used it, and with clients that I'm working with, I've used it, that it is really just right there, concrete in your face, countering all of that strong emotion that says, get rid of the discomfort. There's something that can help anchor me to here's what I really want. Here's the actual, more accurate picture of what's happening here. So having that pros and cons list to review in moments of distress is really concrete help.
Yes. And one last thing, I realized we didn't really go into this much, but when you're doing your pros and cons, think about short-term advantages and disadvantages and also long-term. So we didn't do this with procrastination, but if we were going to think about long-term and short-term consequences, if you have a life where procrastination is your main go-to, you're probably not going to build the life you want.
I do think that's like an important factor to consider is not just the short-term pros and cons of acting on the crisis urge, but also the long term. So for instance, like, yeah, like I carry this shame with me and this dread with me throughout my life. And it does make it harder and it drains energy from doing other things that are important to me. That's a significant long-term con of acting on my procrastination. That's very different than the short term. pros and cons.
Yeah, and we might say a long-term pro of resisting procrastination is that it will build over time, like this building mastery skill, that it will increase your sense of self-confidence and self-esteem over time. And so that's a long-term positive consequence. And I feel like the pros and cons list, if you bring in both short-term and long-term consequences, it's kind of like a message or communication with your future self. So if I act on this crisis behavior, and I do this every time something stressful comes up, who am I going to be in 10 years? And do I want to be that person?
Definitely. Yeah, I think that, ideally the pros and cons is this activity that we do when we're in wise mind that reminds us when emotion mind is really strong of what our short-term and long-term goals are, so that we are continuing to build the life that we want, and that we're not letting strong emotion or strong distress get in our way of building that life.
Thank you, Ed. Thanks for listening to today's episode. To learn more, or if you're in the Bay Area and want to get started with therapy, you can find us online at bayareadbtcc.com. That's bayareadbtcc.com.